Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's right to say this is a requirement that applied in 2009 and 2014, and there is a requirement under European law for us to have a declaration supplied to other member states about their citizens voting in this country to prevent double voting. And it's interesting that those who are usually great fans of following European law didn't want to follow this particular piece of it.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister told me that he had received official advice that it would not be possible to bring forward a statutory instrument in advance of the European elections in order to allow more time for EU citizens to declare their intention as to where they wish to vote. And that would not be possible because it would contravene European law. Can I ask, how can that be the case given that other European countries do it differently and the EU law sets no time requirements for registration? And will he publish the advice that he received?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. EU law makes clear we have to supply details of the declaration sufficiently before polling day, which rather conflicted with the Scottish National Party's idea, suggested a couple of weeks ago, that we could fill in declarations at the polling station. Quite clearly, you can't do something before polling day and collect information collected on polling day. But we were clear that with the timescales, we followed the legal process that was there from the previous European parliamentary elections and complied with all our legal obligations.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this matter, the Minister appears to be taking his cue from Shaggy, protesting it wasn't me. 6 times yesterday, he refused to apologise to these EU citizens that have been disenfranchised. So can I suggest, Mr. Speaker, that he change the record and perhaps take a cue from Timberland and apologise to those European citizens who have every right to vote in these elections but were turned away on polling day?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it does seem like a bit of a broken record from the Labour Party and not acceptance that this is exactly the same process EU citizens had to follow whilst the Labour Party was in government to vote in European parliamentary elections. I must say the best assessment, though, will be the one done by the Electoral Commission, which will do so independently following their statutory duty to review major polling events.
Number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government is committed to meeting the requirements of the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities in respect of Cornish populations. We work with Cornwall Council to encourage the promotion of Cornish culture and have committed £100,000 over 2 years to the Council to support this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. But in 2014, when the decision was made by the Council of Europe, the Government welcomed the decision and said that this would give the Cornish the same recognition as the other Celtic parts of the UK. So does the Minister share my view that in order to keep this commitment, the Cornish should be allowed to identify in the forthcoming census as Cornish by way of a tick box, just as the Scots, Welsh and Northern Irish will be able to do?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I always welcome the determination shown by the honourable member to be a strong Cornish voice for Cornwall here in this chamber and to put the county first on the agenda. What I would say is the Government will be guided by the ONS's recommendations to Government and Parliament about the demand for particular questions when we lay the census orders later this year.
Scott Mann.
Bless you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. One of the best ways that the Department can recognise Cornish minority status is to drop the ludicrous suggestion of having a Cornwall-Devon boundary in the boundary review. Will the Minister commit to giving the Cornish the same rights as the Welsh and Scots?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say that the boundary review is independent and in due course we will bring the orders before the House for the House to make a decision.
Yes, I rise with a degree of uncertainty because I seek ordinarily to accommodate the Honourable Lady, but the question has not been broadened by the character and content of the answer, and I would just very gently point out that Glasgow Central is a considerable distance from Cornwall. But if the Honourable Lady is sufficiently dexterous as to shoehorn an inquiry on Cornwall into a question about Cornwall, that would be very helpful. Honourable Lady.
I thank Mr. Speaker for your indulgence. Protection of the Cornish language is very important, but there is no right, as there is for the Welsh, to write to the UK Government in Cornish, as there is no right to write to the UK Government in Gaelic and receive a response in that language. Would you consider a UK language protection bill, which would then protect Cornish and Scots Gaelic in the same way as Welsh is protected?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we can see the Celtic roots are very strong, both in Cornwall and in Scotland, and the link there is between. Let's say, we're always keen to help promote the culture of these isles and how the different languages that are spoken across these isles are part of our vibrant, united kingdom. And the Cabinet Office is always open to suggestions about how we can better do that, as the Department most keen to promote our union.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to interim... Oh, sorry. Number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will take questions 4 and 11 together. This government is delivering a programme of work to strengthen the integrity of our electoral system and ensure our elections are secure and fit for the 21st century. Validated figures will be published as part of both the Cabinet Office and the Independent Electoral Commission's evaluations of the 2019 pilots.
Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to interim figures for the pilot areas in May, 800 people were denied their vote due to ID requirements. Yet last year, there are only 8 reported cases of personalisation fraud across the whole country. Minister, isn't the reality clear now that this isn't about protecting our electoral system, this is about voter suppression?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say, if it was so bad, why did the Labour Party introduce a system of voter ID in Northern Ireland that has had no noticeable impact on voter turnout? But to be clear, this is about securing the ballot, and we will look forward to the Electoral Commission's conclusions on the pilots.
Jim Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister not agree with me that electoral fraud is very rare in this country and could be tackled locally? And if he thinks it should be tackled locally, will he help local government with the resources?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to have a question from my friend from Coventry South. What I would say is, we have a range of measures we're taking to secure the protection of our electoral system. And I don't think an ID check that originated in the 19th century, based on a very small percentage of the community voting, and I must say of men voting, where they would all be known, is the one that's still fit in the 21st century.
Bumpers Club.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think most people would think that voter ID requirements are perfectly reasonable. But in terms of these pilots, what steps were taken to comprehensively ensure that people were aware of the requirements?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his question. There was a range of work done locally, supported by the Electoral Commission and the Cabinet Office with the councils concerned, to ensure voters were aware of the requirements. And the indication so far is it's been successful, but we'll of course look to the Electoral Commission's independent review before taking further decisions on this process.
York.
5, sir.
Minister Brandon Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is working with disability organisations to help political parties better support disabled candidates. And in December 2018, we launched the £250,000 Enable Fund, providing grants that cover disability-related expenses that people might face when seeking elected office.
Speaker, I've met so many talented students with disabilities in Cheltenham from the National Star College, so I commend my right honourable friend for removing disability expenses from the electoral spending limit. But this is something surely that should apply across the United Kingdom. Does he not agree with me that it should be rolled out to Wales too?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes a very good point. I mean, this is, of course, a matter for the Welsh Labour Party in the Welsh Assembly, but we have taken the view here that excluding disability-related expenses is vital in terms of closing the gap between candidates with disabilities and candidates without disabilities, which, of course, therefore enhances the equality of opportunity.
Gregory Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, in supporting candidates with disabilities to stand in elections, does the Minister not agree that we can have a further benefit in hoping that we result in the voting population who have disabilities coming to the voting booths in person to vote for disabled or able-bodied candidates?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman makes a very good point. I think it is good for us to make sure that we have got candidates from all backgrounds and with all abilities, and candidates with disabilities having the opportunity to stand. And there's a duty for all of us in political parties to do that. So I'm very proud of the Conservative Party that we have a fund within the party to support candidates who need extra help.
Sir David Evanet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's comments in answer to this question. Does he agree with me that we all want to encourage maximum participation to ensure that we get the very best candidates to to stand and participate in all elections?
Yeah.
My right honourable friend makes a very good point. Absolutely right. And as I say, I think it's why I'm very proud to be chairman of a party that has got a fund through our Conservative Foundation that actually does put money in to support candidates in that way. And I think it's on all of us in all political parties to support candidates of all types and all abilities to be able to come forward, stand and represent their constituents.
Can I encourage the Minister to look at hidden disabilities as well as physical disabilities such as fibromyalgia and ME to make sure that those people with hidden disabilities that might not be instantly recognisable are also included in the democratic process?
Yes, I think the honourable gentleman's right. It's upon all of us to make sure we have a holistic approach to make sure that nobody is ever left behind and everybody has a chance to reach their full potential.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
A minister. Not just a minister, but the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Mr. David Lidington.
The National Cyber Security Centre provides expert technical advice to government departments and contractors, but also to the wider private and public sectors on how to prevent, detect and recover from cyber attacks.
Ray Tracy.
Thank my right honourable friend for that answer. And does he agree with me that whilst it's important to ensure that we protect government from attacks to new systems, that we also protect the legacy systems as well?
I completely agree with that, Mr. Speaker, and I think that whoever leads the next government, it would be good advice for the relevant department to take forward a consolidated bid in the next public spending round so that this can be tackled on a cross-government basis.
Mr. Speaker, providing national insurance data can be at the root of the difficulties that young people face when registering to vote. So can the Minister identify how government departments can better share data with local councils to help more people exercise their democratic rights and still ensure cybersecurity?
Mr. Speaker, we are looking at the potential reform of how the canvassing operation by local authorities to compile the electoral register takes place. As the honourable gentleman will appreciate, there is a fine balance to be struck between the benefits one gets from data sharing between different government agencies, but also the importance of maintaining the confidentiality of very sensitive private data.
Joe Platt.
Mr. Speaker, today the Public Accounts Committee has found that incredibly a third of the funding for the government's cyber security strategy has been transferred or loaned to other government projects, and £69 million of cyber funding has been taken from the strategy completely. Could the Minister therefore confirm whether it's because the government does not think our cyber security is an important priority for them, or whether it's because even national security is not exempt from Tory austerity?
Mr. Speaker, what the report shows very clearly is that the cyber security of this country, and particularly of government departments and agencies, has been strengthened since the introduction and implementation of the National Cyber Security Strategy, and the work that the National Cyber Security Centre in particular is leading on this is helping government departments and the private sector alike to keep in touch with the developing, changing nature of the threat and to raise our defences accordingly.
Question number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is committed to scrapping the arbitrary 15-year rule. We were disappointed that my honourable friend, the member for Montgomeryshire's Overseas Electors Bill did not succeed, but we remain committed to implementing Votes for Life and are considering next steps to deliver this.
Sir David Amis.
Well, friend, aware that not everyone is enthusiastic about these changes, starting with myself. And even though it would affect 2 of my daughters who live permanently in America, I cannot for the life of me understand the justification for these changes. And I wonder if he'd also like to comment on reciprocal arrangements for non-nationals voting here.
Well, thank the honourable member for his question, but I will have to disagree with him. I'm clear that we need to take the choice that's right for this country and for our citizens who live abroad, many of whom have literally fought for this country and still retain very strong emotional connections to this country and an interest in its affairs. And therefore, that is why we view the government's view is the 15-year limit is arbitrary and should be removed.
Finally, in this section, Mr. Tammanjeet Singh Desi.
Number 9, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are doing more than ever to encourage SMEs in public procurement, and indeed recently published figures show an increase in spend from the previous year. Examples of measures we've taken include streamlining procurement processes, improving transparency, and from September we will be able to exclude suppliers that fail to pay subcontractors on time.
Oh, really?
Mr. Speaker, research from the Federation of Small Businesses shows that 25% of businesses who are in supply chains for public infrastructure projects experience late payment more than half of the time. So, along with lagging behind dismally on its target of spending 33% of central government procurement with SMEs by 2022, isn't this yet more evidence that this government simply does not represent the interests of small businesses?
Well, I would have thought the honourable gentleman would welcome figures that show we are spending more with small businesses than ever before. On his point about prompt payment, we set a very challenging target of 90% of undisputed invoices from SMEs being paid within 5 days, and we're meeting that for most departments.
On the topical questions, Lloyd Russell-Moyle. Minister David Lidington.
We're now moving towards the 20th anniversary of devolution in Scotland and Wales, and are making every effort possible to restore devolved government in Northern Ireland. Under this government, the devolved parliaments have been given more powers than ever before, with new powers over income tax, transport and the benefit system. And we've been clear that when the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, a significant number of powers will flow back to those parliaments. We're committed to upholding the devolution settlements and to strengthening the union between all parts of the United Kingdom.
Well, I'm not sure that the Minister is being accorded the respectful attention that his celebrity status within Her Majesty's government warrants, and I hope there can be an improvement upon that in the minutes ahead. Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Yesterday in the urgent question it was asked how many names of EU citizens were transmitted from this country to other countries after the 7th of May deadline. And what is the government's response to the fact that under the directive, Article 9.4 says that EU citizens shall remain eligible to vote in perpetuity and not have to fill in additional forms?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The process was exactly the same as for previous European parliamentary elections, and I would urge the honourable member to look at the independent review the Electoral Commission will do following the poll.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What's the government doing to encourage maximum participation in elections, and in particular to encourage young people to register to vote?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is committed to ensuring all citizens feel empowered to participate in democracy, and the Cabinet Office itself, we have delivered some projects to promote and encourage participation among young people, including a scheme to recruit and train some 1,000 youth democracy ambassadors. But I would also say to honourable friend, I know he has worked personally very hard on this himself, and great credit to him for that, because political parties have a role to play in getting young people involved in politics as well. And I'm very proud that in the Conservative Party, with my honourable friend's good work, we have seen over 100 new young Conservative branches in just a year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that the government has been spending a lot of our money on private polling to find out what the people of Scotland think about their so-called precious union. Are there any plans to carry out similar polling to find out what the people of Scotland think of the demand that our health service should be sacrificed to curry favour with Donald Trump?
Mr. Speaker, I think that the Prime Minister could not have been clearer yesterday that the future of the NHS is not on the table in trade negotiations, and the honourable member would be better advised to focus on the need to improve the declining standards in the Scottish NHS, for which his party is responsible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a number of former rugby residents who live abroad, including Claire Nurcombe, who lives in France, who I still represent here, have told me about their wish to retain voting rights in the UK. The Minister has already referred to the commitment to British nationals to retain voting rights for life. So can he give some clarity as to when that may be delivered?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and his examples show why an arbitrary 15-year limit is not correct. What I will say to him is the government is looking for what options we can take to bring this forward at the earliest opportunity.
Will the government commit that by the time of the next general election, not a single primary school will have to close to be a polling station?
I thank the honourable member for his question. Legislation does allow returning officers to use schools as polling places to ensure there is sufficient provision of polling places, and he will appreciate there will be a balance, particularly because we need to look for accessible buildings, and in some cases schools will be the only ones. But again, there should be a discussion between returning officers and schools to ensure the burden of this requirement is not too high.
Merriman! Speaker, isn't it time that we gave 16 and 17-year-olds a vote so that they are empowered to use their voice?
Yeah, the vast majority of liberal democracies worldwide consider 18 the right age to enfranchise young people, including Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And Parliament has debated the question of lowering the voting age in a number of contexts and has repeatedly voted against lowering it.
David Duquette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last week, Nicola Sturgeon brought forward legislation in the Scottish Parliament for another independence referendum in Holyrood, clearly much to the delight of the members opposite. However, this is despite recent polling showing that fewer than 1 in 5 Scots want another independence referendum in the next couple of years. What discussions has the Minister had with representatives of the Scottish Government in relation to these developments, and can the Minister reassure me and the House that the UK Government will continue to uphold the result of the 2014 referendum and say no to this unwanted independence referendum?
Mr. Speaker, it was the First Minister herself who said of the 2014 referendum that this was a once-in-a-generation decision. I believe that we should take her at her word during that referendum campaign, and we should uphold the clear will of the Scottish people as expressed in the 2014 referendum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To strengthen the Union, what actions has the government taken to deliver investment and growth to all 4 nations of our United Kingdom, especially in places like Stoke-on-Trent?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is quite right, but that is why such measures as the Modern Industrial Strategy and the City Deals programme bring benefits to every part of the United Kingdom. As my honourable friend knows, Stoke-on-Trent has benefited from the Transforming Cities programme to the tune of more than £5.5 million, and from the ultra-fast broadband programme by more than £9 million.
Kirsten Hare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my honourable friend said, Nicola Sturgeon laid for her second independence referendum last week, with only 1 in 5 Scots supporting what she is doing. So can the Minister assure me that his department are doing all they can to protect and preserve our United Kingdom we're so proud to be part of?
Mr. Speaker, the government believes, and I believe the majority of people in Scotland continue to believe, that all of us are stronger by being proud of being Scottish, English, Welsh or Northern Irish, but also part of a union of 4 nations in the United Kingdom.
Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Tim Lawton.
Number 1, sir.
Prime Minister.
I have been asked to reply. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is today with other world leaders in Portsmouth to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings. That operation involved, this event today will involve more than 4,000 personnel in D-Day events in the United Kingdom and in France, and it will involve representatives from every country that fought alongside the United Kingdom in Operation Overlord, and, appropriately, our former adversaries as well. And I'm sure that members right across the House will want to join me in paying tribute to the sacrifice of those who fought to secure the liberty and peace that we enjoy today, and for the courage that made possible then the restoration of democracy, human rights and the rule of law to our continent of Europe. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure also that the whole House will want to join me in sending our very best wishes to our Muslim constituents here in the United Kingdom and to Muslims around the world celebrating Eid al-Fitr. I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others earlier today, and I shall be having further such meetings later on today.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, as the Chancellor says, today in Portsmouth and tomorrow in Normandy, we honour the veterans and the 150,000 British, American, Canadian and other Allied troops who led the charge to liberate Europe against the real Nazi scum. So does my right honourable friend agree that when a minority of hate-fueled demonstrators yell Nazi scum in the faces of American tourists and intimidate others legitimately welcoming the visit of the American president, however we may take issue with him, and regrettably spurred on by certain honourable members of this House, that they attack the greatest alliance of free nations and they demean the memory of those brave troops and veterans whose very sacrifice secured the right of all of us to free speech and to protest lawfully?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with every word that my honourable friend has just said, and I think that it's worth reminding ourselves that the fact that we and our neighbouring countries across the Channel enjoy today the freedom to express our views publicly, to assemble and to demonstrate our points of view, to argue peacefully against one another in this place, are derived from the courage and the sacrifice of the wartime generation, whether from the United Kingdom or the United States of America or our other allies, and we should remember and salute that courage and that sacrifice and not demean it by the sort of disgraceful behaviour to which my honourable friend referred.
Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be stepping in on behalf of my colleagues today, and indeed to be opposite the right honourable gentleman. And might I echo his comments made regarding the marking of the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landing, which are being commemorated today in Portsmouth. We must never forget the extraordinary sacrifices of all those who landed that day in Normandy, and the achievements of our servicemen and women who came together to fight fascism and protect our freedom. I'd also like to wish an Eid al-Fitr to all of our Muslim friends right across the United Kingdom, and I also want to express solidarity to all women fighting pension injustice in court and outside Parliament today. I'd also like to congratulate both English teams who competed in the Champions League final on Saturday. And as a Man United fan, it pains me to congratulate Liverpool on their victory. Although fair play, fans did rename Margaret Thatcher Square in Madrid Jeremy Corbyn Square. And I reckon that deserves brownie points even from a Man United fan. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister had to repeat to President Trump a journalist's question about whether the NHS is on the table as part of a US trade deal. Given the Prime Minister was silent on the matter, perhaps the right honourable gentleman could clarify the government's position. Will the Tory party give US companies access to the NHS, yes or no?
Well, can I first of all welcome the Honourable Lady to these new responsibilities for her, and to agree with the comments she made both about D-Day and about the success of English football teams in the recent 2 European Championships, and also to wish well to both the English and Scottish women's 11 for their forthcoming matches. I welcome the Honourable Lady. I feel slightly sorry for the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Islington South, who I'm used to jousting with, who seems to have been dispatched to internal exile somewhere else along the front bench. And, you know, it's perhaps it's just the Honourable Lady perhaps needs to watch out, because I think there's a lesson there that anybody who at the dispatch box outshines the dear leader risks being airbrushed out of the Politburo history at the earliest opportunity. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has been very clear, and she spoke for everyone in the government and on this side of the House. When it comes to trade negotiations, the NHS is not and will not be up for sale.
He's full of
the banter today, Mr. Speaker. Well, the President certainly seemed to think the NHS was on the table yesterday. So does the Trade Secretary. But who knows who speaks for the government at the moment? And the Prime Minister did nothing to allay concerns yesterday. So I hope she was more forceful in raising climate change, with a President who initiated the US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, opened up record amounts of land for oil and gas drilling, and called climate change a hoax. Can the right honourable gentleman confirm if yesterday the Prime Minister made any attempt to convince him that climate change is in fact real?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my right friend, the Prime Minister, did raise climate change with the President yesterday, and she made clear at their joint press conference yesterday afternoon that that is what she had done. We are very proud of this country's commitment to the international agreements to reduce global carbon emissions, and we have a better track record in reducing those emissions than any other G7 member state.
Long Bailey. Speaker, the statistics that the right honourable gentleman referred to relates to emissions cuts since 2010, when the UK benefited from policies put in by the last Labour government, policies which have since been dismantled. But how much authority does this government actually have on this issue? 3 current cabinet ministers have denied the scientific consensus on climate change, and several of those standing in the Tory leadership contest have close links with organisations and individuals promoting climate denial. Mr. Speaker, it does not bode well. Figures released in April show that the UK is set to miss its own carbon budgets by an ever-widening margin. Would the right honourable gentleman like to explain why the government is off track to meeting its own targets?
Mr. Speaker, we're not off track towards meeting those targets at all. Since 2010, the United Kingdom has decarbonised our economy faster than any other G7 country. We generate now a record amount of electricity from renewable energy sources, and we have just gone through the longest period in our history without relying on electricity generated from coal. That stands rather starkly against what appears to be the Labour Party's declared policy, which is to reopen the coal mines, but not actually to burn the coal that they mine.
Clear, Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party does not condone the reopening of any coal mine to be used for energy purposes. And once again, Mr. Speaker, he refers to climate emissions reductions that were implemented using Labour Party policy. Labour policies that have since been dismantled. And not only is the government failing to meet its targets, but last year actually saw the smallest drop in carbon emissions in the last 6 years. Just 2%. At that rate, it would take until the end of the century to reach net zero emissions. And Mr. Speaker, just yesterday, the Financial Times reported that the government is accused of trying to fiddle its emissions figures, ignoring its official advisers. So let me ask the right honourable gentleman a simple policy question. The Labour Party has committed to banning fracking. Will the government ban fracking and allow new onshore wind in England, yes or no?
What the government is committed to is to reducing emissions in line with both our domestic and global targets. And we have not just met, but we have outperformed our first and second carbon budgets, and we are on track towards meeting the third. There is going to be a need for some time into the future to use gas as a transitional fuel, but that is much less polluting than other forms of hydrocarbon-based energy, and it therefore is a good source during the transition period while we make ready to move to a completely decarbonised economy.
Rebecca Long-Bailey. Well, this is absolutely staggering. The government promotes fracking, backed by only 12% of the public, effectively blocks onshore wind, backed by 79% of the public. New solar is down 94%. 94%. Home insulation is down 98%. Mr. Speaker, Parliament declared a climate emergency. Yet there is no evidence this government takes this seriously. We need a green industrial revolution to tackle climate change. And alone, Swansea's tidal lagoon would have required 100,000 tonnes of steel, mainly from Port Talbot, but the government refused to back it. Can the right honourable gentleman tell us what the government has actually done since signing the Steel Charter to support our steel industry?
Mr. Speaker, if one looks at what is actually happening in the real world, rather than the ideological tracts which the honourable lady appears to spend her time reading, you will see, Mr. Speaker, that there are about 400,000 jobs already in low-carbon businesses and their supply chains throughout the United Kingdom, and scope for much more low-carbon growth to support up to 2 million jobs in the future. We now have received advice from the Independent Climate Change Committee about how to time and to legislate for our transition to a completely decarbonised economy, and we will be bringing forward our decisions later this year as to how and when we will be taking that action.
Well, the Independent Climate Change Committee has repeatedly criticised the government's approach to decarbonising our economy, but I know in the right honourable gentleman's response there was not a single word on what support the government will provide the steel industry, and people from Redcar to Scunthorpe know that his empty rhetoric will not solve their catastrophe. Mr. Speaker, climate change is an existential threat. To safeguard our future, we will need to mobilise all of our resources, just like we did when we rebuilt Britain after the Second World War. If we took the challenge seriously, we could create hundreds of thousands of jobs in low-carbon industries, reverse decades of decline in our deindustrialised areas, and lead the world in renewable technologies. But the government is letting us down. They have recklessly run the clock down on Brexit. But I say to the right honourable member, isn't it the truth that their failure is now running down the clock on our planet?
Mr. Speaker, sir, the honourable lady asked about government help for the steel industry. The answer to her question is that we have provided taxpayer-funded subsidies to cut energy costs in the steel industry. We have supported globally and introduced here trade defence measures to shut out unfair competition and dumping from steel. And when I was in Sheffield a few days ago, I talked to specialist steelmakers in South Yorkshire who welcomed this government's commitment there to the Advanced Manufacturing Centre, to the work that we are doing on technical and vocational training, and who were optimistic about the future of steelmaking and manufacturing in this country under the policies that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Business, has been taking through. Now, the truth is, when I looked at the honourable lady's video about the Labour Party's new commitment to a green industrial revolution, it concluded with a focus on the words about renationalisation. Bring back into public ownership, as if that were the way forward. Now, we know from the CBI, Mr. Speaker, that the cost of that would be £176 billion taken from the pockets of taxpayers throughout the United Kingdom. That money could be used to build 3 million new homes. Those Labour policies would put at risk the finances of decent working families in every part of this country. And
Marcus Fish. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Somerset has been helping illustrate the huge national challenge we face in social care through a powerful panorama programme, the final part of which airs tonight. Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to all in caring roles and commit to addressing their funding needs fully?
Mr. Speaker, can I first of all thank my honourable friend for highlighting this important issue. We're committed to ensuring that people of all ages have access to the care and support they need. That's why we've given local authorities access to nearly £4 billion more for adult social care this year. but we recognise that we also need to make sure that best practice is observed across all local authorities and NHS trusts, where the evidence is that delayed discharges are higher in some areas than in others. We will be publishing the Green Paper at the earliest opportunity to set out the hard strategic choices that are going to face the government, whoever leads the government in the months to come, and to describe proposals to ensure that the social care system is sustainable over the longer term.
Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to associate myself and my SNP colleagues with the comments of others. Our thoughts are with the veterans gathered in Portsmouth today to commemorate the anniversary of D-Day. Today is also World Environment Day, an important reminder that climate change remains the biggest challenge facing the world. And also, I'd like to wish a very, very happy Eid Mubarak to all of those celebrating across the UK today. Yesterday, Donald Trump said that the NHS was on the table in the trade talks with the UK. Today, he says he's not so sure. This is someone who doesn't even believe in climate change. A president who simply cannot be trusted. Why, then, is the UK government so obsessed with pursuing a trade deal that puts Scotland's NHS at risk?
Mr. Speaker, the government is not putting the NHS at risk in Scotland or anywhere else, and the Prime Minister has made that very clear indeed. What I fear is putting at risk standards in the NHS in Scotland is the SNP's obsession with constitutional matters and a referendum, rather than focusing on the better delivery of public services.
Mr. Speaker, we have the best performing NHS in the UK. With the highest number of GPs per head of population. If this week has proven anything, it has proven that there is no guarantee our NHS is safe. In 2014, Westminster promised Scotland's NHS would be in public hands for as long as the people of Scotland wanted it. But now, this Tory government is actively working to deny the Scottish Parliament the powers to safeguard our NHS and protect our public services. The truth is, under this government, Scotland won't have a veto. We may not even have a say. The Scottish Government will never allow our precious NHS to be signed away in a Tory-Trump trade deal. If the Minister and his fellow MPs cannot make that same pledge here today, they will never, ever be forgiven.
Mr. Speaker, the risk of repeating myself, under this government and under stewardship of anybody on this side of the House, the NHS is not going to be up for grabs in a trade negotiation with the United States or with anybody else at all. And I would say to the Honourable Lady that when she talks about the need for a voice for Scotland, she ought to have more confidence in the ability of herself and her colleagues to represent the interests of Scotland here in the debates and in the committees on which they sit. At the moment, they're leaving it to my 13 colleagues on this side to be the true voice of Scotland.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I know from my own personal experience what it takes to win a seat from the Labour Party and hold it. Will my right honourable friend agree with me that every community in this country needs a strong voice in this place, and the people of Peterborough tomorrow have the opportunity to elect Paul Bristow to give them that voice to replace the failed Labour MP who ended up in jail?
Mr. Speaker, I very much endorse what my right honourable friend says. and I believe that in Paul Bristow, Peterborough would have a formidable champion for the interests of the residents of every part of that borough.
Laura Pidcock!
Mr. Speaker, I know that the right honourable gentleman is just a stand-in while the vultures circle, but I want to ask what he thinks of the legacy left by the Prime Minister. A deeply divided country where 14 million people live in poverty, where 130,000 preventable deaths have been caused by austerity since 2012, a country where 17,000 people can die while they are waiting for disability benefits, where homelessness is soaring, destitution is rife, and a UN rapporteur can describe Britain as defined by harsh and uncaring ethos. I don't want to personalise this because everyone on those benches is responsible, but what kind of legacy is that?
Mr. Speaker, the legacy of my right honourable friend will be a country in which income inequality is down, in which wages have been rising faster than inflation for more than a year, where we have the lowest unemployment since the 1970s and record numbers of people in jobs. And it's about time that the honourable lady stop talking our country down. On this side, we want to raise our country up.
David T.C. Davis!
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend think it's acceptable that people with access to large sums of money are able to bring about private prosecutions in a way that undermines freedom of speech in this country?
Mr. Speaker, let me say two things about my honourable friend's question. First of all, I believe that freedom of speech is one of our most precious inheritances from previous generations, and we should do everything we can in this place and outside to uphold that principle. When it comes to any specific case, it would clearly be wrong of me to pass comment on something that is before the courts.
Jay Stevens!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last weekend, my constituency suffered yet more serious violent crime, some in the public domain and some which isn't, including the murder of 18-year-old Fahad Mohammed Noor and a knife attack on the congregation leaving Dar al-Isra Mosque following Ramadan prayers. Since 2010, under Liberal Democrat and Conservative government, South Wales police funding has been cut by nearly £61 million. Police officers in Cardiff are running on empty. What will it take for this shambles of a government to accept responsibility for public safety and give South Wales Police the funding they desperately need?
Well, Mr. Speaker, South Wales Police is actually receiving up to £290 million in funding in the current financial year, which is an increase of £19 million on the last financial year. But to get to grips with serious crime, and I think no one would have anything but sympathy for the victims whom she referred to and their families, we also need to look at what it is that drives young men in particular towards gang membership and participation in violent crime. And that is the work that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, in partnership with other ministers, is now leading, and which I hope will bring benefits to her constituency and to many others.
Mr. Speaker, the motor industry is vital to the economy of Rugby and the West Midlands, and so was my right honourable friend concerned to see that UK manufacturing statistics from the SMMT showed that in April production fell by 44%, because of factory shutdowns for the unexpected certainty of a 29th of March Brexit. Does he agree that this should act as a wake-up call to ensure that the same thing doesn't happen again on the 31st of October by leaving the EU with a deal which will take away the uncertainty that is so damaging to our manufacturers?
I think my honourable friend makes a very important point, and the car industry is one of the most important, but by no means the only sector in this country that relies heavily upon just-in-time cross-border supply chains with enterprises in other member states of the European Union. That is why the government remains focused on ensuring that our departure from the EU is smooth and orderly, and with a deal which allows for those just-in-time supply chains to be protected.
Penny Cook.
Mr. Speaker, of the many collective challenges we face, none is more essential
more urgent than climate breakdown. The legislation required to commit the UK to phasing out carbon emissions entirely by mid-century is simple. It's almost certainly already been drafted, and this House could pass it in a matter of days. This issue is simply too pressing to wait for later this year or a future administration. We have the parliamentary time. What possible reason can the Minister give for why the government cannot commit to enshrine net zero emissions into law now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, may I first of all congratulate the honourable gentleman and his partner on having looked at his Twitter feed on the imminent birth of their second child later this year, and wish both he and his partner well. In terms of his question, it was this government which actually went to the Independent Committee on Climate Change and asked for advice from them about how and over what time frame to make that move to complete decarbonisation. We have only very recently received that advice. That will clearly need to be considered within government, and we want to bring forward our decision at the earliest possible opportunity, because I share his view of the importance of getting on with this.
Ms Green. Mr Speaker, difficult times often call for new leadership and a new vision. Therefore, will my right honourable friend join me in supporting Councillor David Greenhouse's vision for a regeneration of Bolton, his bids for the future High Street Fund, and the recovery of Bolton after 40 years of Labour misrule?
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for highlighting this initiative in Bolton. As he knows, the high streets are changing, and we are committed as a government to helping communities like Bolton to adapt to that change. We've already set in hand the £675 million Future High Streets Fund. We welcome Bolton Council's applications. They're being assessed alongside other applications. We will make an announcement about those places that are successful later this summer. I know my honourable friend will continue to be a very doughty champion for his city.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My local NHS is cutting GP hours while they and NHS England are forced to subsidise a private company, Babylon GP at Hand, which has sucked up over 50,000 patients for its controversial app-based system, undermining GPs across London and beyond. Given the Health Secretary is Babylon's biggest cheerleader, why should my constituents trust this government to keep the NHS public any more than they would trust Donald Trump?
Mr. Speaker, NHS England is, I understand, increasing the baseline funding of Hammersmith and Fulham CCG to ensure it is not financially disadvantaged by hosting GP at Hand. But the NHS, to improve its service to patients, is going to need to embrace innovation, and digital technologies like those used by GP at Hand do offer convenience for patients and often allow clinicians to work more efficiently. And that's why our new GP contract gives everyone the right to digital-first primary care, including web and video consultations from 2021, if that is what they want to receive.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 75 years ago tonight, the first steps in the liberation of Europe were taken by the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry when they dropped by parachute to liberate Pegasus Bridge. As the Dakotas over Normandy commemorate this feat at this present time, will my right honourable friend join with me to celebrate and commemorate all the ordinary and yet extraordinary men and women from every corner of our country who turned the tide of the war in freedom's favour?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for highlighting the particular example of the Pegasus Bridge and the heroism shown by the servicemen from our two counties. But I think he's also right that we need to pay tribute today to the men and women who took part in the success of Operation Overlord from whichever part of the United Kingdom or from whichever allied country they came.
Far too many people in our uniformed public services are taking their own lives. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't know the true extent of these tragedies, as ministers do not require this data to be collected. Will the Minister agree with me that the police, our armed forces and the prison services should follow the lead of the fire service and record the number of people in their service that take their own lives?
I mean, the honourable gentleman makes a a good point. I know he is due to meet with Ministry of Justice ministers fairly soon to talk about whether the MOJ could introduce similar practices for its services, and I will draw his question to the attention of the Minister for Policing to see if a comparable meeting can be established with the Home Office.
Joseph Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, Petts Wood is designated an area of special residential character in the London Borough of Bromley, but it suffered from inconsistent decision-making at the hands of the Planning Inspectorate, which I feel is unaccountable. Would my right honourable friend use his good offices to help me secure the meeting I've long been requesting, which the Planning Inspectorate has for some reason consistently declined?
Well, I'm very happy in the first instance to ensure that my honourable friend has a meeting with the relevant minister in the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and hope that that will enable him to find a way forward.
It would be a gross discourtesy if it were otherwise. Extraordinary that the honourable gentleman should have to ask for a meeting, but there we are, he's going to get his meeting. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, yesterday the US President did say that the NHS was on the table of any trade negotiation, and the PM did not intervene to stop him. The Lib Dems and Tories have already voted through the Health and Social Care Act, which opened up the NHS to the US market. 10% is already privatised. And the Brexit Party leader has no issue with US private healthcare insurance replacing our NHS. No party can be trusted with our NHS except the Labour Party. Isn't Labour now the only hope to save our NHS?
Mr. Speaker, one does get a bit sick of these scare stories after a while. Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady might like to pretend that the majority of NHS contracting out for the private sector did not actually take place under Conservative administration but under the Labour government, with Andy Burnham urging that to be accelerated. Now, the truth is that during the 70-year lifetime of the NHS, it has had more years under Conservative than under Labour stewardship. And if we look at what is happening today, we see the NHS getting the biggest cash boost ever in its history, a long-term plan for its future made possible by Conservative policies.
Mr. Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I remind the House of my members' interests. I echo what the Minister said about our teams going to the World Cup and their performances later on this month, but there is further representation from this country with 3 match officials selected. Shan Massey and Lisa Rashid from England and my colleague from Scotland, Kylie Coburn, all selected to represent their country. So will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating them for their dedication, commitment and ability as match officials, which has seen them called up to the World Cup, and wish all our match officials a successful and productive tournament.
Well, I did feel it was perhaps the shop steward for the Amalgamated Union of Association Football Officials was speaking there. But I'm very happy to join my honourable friend in congratulating Sian, Lisa and Kylie as having been selected as assistant referees. It is a first-class achievement, and I'd like to wish them, as well as both teams, all success for the World Cup.
Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pupils from St Gregory's Primary School in my constituency recently wrote to me regarding the problem of plastic pollution in our environment. They have rightly pointed out the damage that plastic waste causes to marine life and also human life as it makes its way up the food chain. As a result, they are calling on the government to introduce a deposit return scheme that will reduce the amount of plastic that ends up in landfill and in our oceans. On this World Environment Day, does the Minister agree with the pupils of St Gregory's Primary School?
I think that I can give the honourable lady an encouraging message to take back to the pupils of St Gregory's School, which is that under the leadership of my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Environment, the government has launched a resources and waste strategy which includes consulting on plans to introduce consistent recycling for all households and consulting on a deposit return scheme to drive up the recycling of cans and bottles, and plans for producers to pay the full cost of managing packaging waste through extended producer responsibility. Makes a good package.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 30 years ago this week, some 2,000 Democrats, maybe more, we'll never know the number, were murdered in Tiananmen Square. And even now in China, there is a great firewall which prevents Wikipedia, Google, and others communicating with the Chinese people. Now, while China has moved on, does my right honourable friend not think it the height of hypocrisy those who demonstrated against the President of the United States of America, yet chose not to demonstrate against the President of China when he came here?
I think that my honourable friend makes a telling point about the inconsistency in standards that we've seen from some leading members of this House. It is indeed 30 years yesterday since the tragic, shocking events in which so many people lost their lives while protesting peacefully in and around Tiananmen Square. And the sad truth today is that people in China are still unable to exercise their right to protest peacefully, a right given to them by international agreements to which the Chinese government has signed up. And we continue to urge the Chinese government to respect citizens' freedom of association, assembly, expression, and other fundamental rights and freedoms, as is supposed to be enshrined in China's constitution as well as in international law.
Roberts. And I would like to tell the House that Plaid Cymru leader Adam Price is celebrating it with the Normandy Memorial today, and that we share the feeling for all those people who remember that historical event. Now, I guess when President Trump's visit was thought up months ago, the plan was for the UK to have left the EU by then. Take back control, they said. But what we saw this week was a vision of things to come, of razzle-dazzle concealing the reality of sovereignty reduced to sycophancy. 68% of Welsh exports, Mr. Speaker, go to the EU. Only 14% of Welsh exports go to the US. Post-Brexit, the British government will have to choose which deal to strike. Which would he prioritise?
Mr. Speaker, if the Honourable Lady had been studying the various publications from the government, she will have seen that our objective is to have a very close, deep future partnership on trade and other matters with our neighbours in the European Union, while at the same time having the freedom to pursue trade deals with other parts of the world, including with the United States amongst one. And I just do ask the Honourable Lady to just pause before condemning the state visit by the elected head of state and government of our staunchest ally at a time when we commemorate the 70th anniversary of the D-Day landings, and trying to criticise that for political purposes. We can disagree with President Trump. Any of us is free to do that. But he is here as the elected head of state of our staunch, consistent ally, and we should honour and respect him during that visit.
Speaker, I know my right honourable friend will be aware from his recent visit to Cornwall of the potential of development of the space sector in Cornwall, and therefore I'm sure he would join me in welcoming the announcement yesterday of government support of £7.8 million for the development of Europe's first horizontal spaceport in Cornwall. So would he join me in congratulating all the Spaceport Cornwall team for their successful bid? Would he use his office to ensure that the government does everything it can to make sure the regulations are in place for satellites to be launched as soon as possible? And while he's on his feet, would he congratulate the Cornish rugby team for their excellent win on Sunday against Cheshire to become county championship?
Well, I'm delighted to congratulate the Cornish rugby team, as my honourable friend invites me to do. I was also very pleased indeed to see the decision being made to give that support to the Cornwall Spaceport Initiative. I remember very vividly meeting representatives of the spaceport during my visit to the Goonhilly Earth Station earlier this year, and I think there are some really exciting commercial opportunities available for Cornwall and the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, in July 2016, my constituent Mr. Goff was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, a form of blood cancer. He was treated with 2 lines of chemotherapy and initially responded well, but had recurrent infections which required antibiotics. He went into remission in 2018, and his PIP was stopped in December 2018. Mr. Goff appealed the decision despite the fact that he was receiving treatment. His appeal was refused. In February, he was told his cancer had relapsed. It is incurable. He's now been told his mobility car will be repossessed this week. Removing his PIP will leave him short of money, unable to get to most of his daily appointments, and at risk of infection when travelling on public transport. Can I appeal to everybody on those benches over there? Show some compassion. Someone intervene and stop this injustice.
The honourable member will appreciate that I don't know any more about the detail of his constituent's case than what he has just set out before the House. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, is in her place on the front bench, will have heard what he said, and I shall ask her to make sure that a minister from that department speaks to the honourable gentleman urgently to get to the bottom of what has happened.
Mr. Speaker, the National Readership Challenge launches today, and can I particularly recommend to colleagues the conclusions on further education in the government's post-18 education review to reverse the decline of core spending, to increase the unit funding rate and to allow for 3-year funding plans. Does my right honourable friend agree that this should be essential reading for Treasury Ministers before the autumn spending review, and that more funding for further education would be very welcome?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very important point about the vital role that further education provides, both in equipping young men and women with skills they need to give them good career opportunities, but also often as providing a passport through to higher education at a later stage in their careers. The Augur Review provides a blueprint of how we can make sure that everybody can follow the path that is right for them, and he's right to say that we need to study Augur's conclusions carefully in the run-up to the forthcoming spending review.
MacDonald. Well, Mr. Speaker, Police Scotland prepared a report on extraordinary rendition flights stopping through Scottish airports for the Crown Office. Counter-terrorism officers and the Lord Advocate have made clear that they require full access to the unredacted Senate Intelligence Committee report from the United States government, but they have so far refused to do so, and therefore it's prohibiting them determining whether or not a crime was committed. So given intelligence sharing is supposed to underpin our relationship with the US, has anyone from the government raised this with President Trump whilst he's been here? And if not, will he pledge to do so on behalf of Scotland's law enforcement agencies before he departs UK soil today?
Mr. Speaker, unsurprisingly, and in line with President under all governments, I'm not prepared to discuss security intelligence matters on the floor of the House, but I will draw the honourable gentleman's question to the attention of those of my colleagues in government who are directly responsible for these areas of policy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My thoughts today are with my 94-year-old stepfather, who has once again returned to Normandy to remember that it was soldiers, sailors and airmen from not only the UK and the US, but allies, especially all over the Commonwealth, who fought for our lives. And can we use this moment to thank them, to thank those who serve in our armed forces today, and to thank our Prime Minister, who in her last few days in this job is serving our country with great dignity.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her question, and I'm sure that she will be able to take back to her stepfather a salute from the entire House for the service of himself and his comrades in Normandy 75 years ago. I agree with every word that my honourable friend said.
And finally, Carl Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 12 months ago, the Prime Minister told this House that she wanted a speedy resolution to the funding row between NHS England and Vertex for the drug Orkambi to treat cystic fibrosis. My 7-year-old constituent, Oliver Ward, wrote to the Prime Minister recently asking what progress she's made. Could the Minister please give Oliver some good news and tell him that he needn't get up every day worrying about this terrible injustice?
Mr. Speaker, I shall ask the Health Secretary of one of his team to contact the honourable gentleman at the earliest opportunity to try and give Oliver the news that he wishes for.
Yes, very well. Point of order. Point of order, Mr. Martin Doherty Hughes.
Mr.
It relates to matters that can't wait until after the urgent questions, not because of the fullness of the honourable gentleman's diary, but because the matter appertains to exchanges that have just taken place. Oh, very good. Point of order, Mr. Martin Doherty Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, in a day in which we commemorate the freedom of Europe, it's come to my attention the weekend that a fellow member of the Council of Europe, the Georgian state, and especially its Ministry of the Interior, will not give security during Pride Month to the first ever Pride March through Tbilisi. Given the history of anti-LGBT violence funded by the Russian state in previous years, I wonder, Mr. Speaker, how can we convey not only to the government of Georgia, but to its ambassador within the United Kingdom, that not only is this House concerned, but gravely disappointed in their limitation on human dignity within the Georgian nation.
The honourable gentleman has partly achieved his objective by the ruse, and I will call it the ruse, of a point of order, which conceivably could have been the substitute for a question that he might have wanted to ask. And if that was his objective, he has achieved it. I can't speak for the House as a whole, but to judge from debates that have taken place in this chamber in recent years, my strong sense is that the honourable gentleman's point will have struck a chord. The idea that such a march should not be able to take place within a safe space and its participants' physical security underpinned is something which I think offends very strongly against our instincts. So I hope that such measures as are necessary to be taken by Georgians will be taken, and more widely, if I heard the honourable gentleman correctly, he made what struck me as a wholly uncontroversial observation about the record of the Russian state in terms of human rights generally, and more particularly the protection, or rather the non-protection, of the rights of LGBT people. That is a profoundly unsatisfactory state of affairs, and it's about time that they became more civilised in these important matters. Thank you. If there are no... it's always good to have the sedentary support of the honourable gentleman member for Lichfield, and I thank the honourable gentleman for what he has said. We come now to the first of our urgent questions, Jonathan Ashworth.
From the Speaker, to ask the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care to make a statement on the interim NHS People Plan.
Minister Stephen Hammer.
Mr. Speaker, the NHS published its interim People Plan on Monday, and I laid a written ministerial statement at the earliest opportunity yesterday. The plan is a first but critically important step in ensuring the NHS has the people, the leadership and the culture it needs to deliver the long-term NHS plan. The interim People Plan has been developed by Baroness Dido Harding, who is the Chair of NHS Improvement, in partnership with frontline staff, NHS employers and a wide range of other representative groups and stakeholders. It takes a tough look at the challenges facing people working across the NHS. It sets out how leaders will be supported to create cultures that empower staff and make sure every member of staff, regardless of their background, will be able to progress. Critically, the plan calls for all NHS organisations to set out how they will ensure the NHS is the best place to work, and the recently appointed Chief People Officer for the NHS will play a vital role in supporting the NHS to do this. The interim People Plan sets out a number of practical steps to increase the supply of clinical staff. This includes an extra 5,000 additional clinical places for nurse training places by September 2019 and commits to a further expansion of medical school places. Ultimately, the plan will ensure that the NHS is best able to retain the highly skilled and dedicated staff who choose a career in healthcare, including the most senior clinicians. Therefore, we have listened to their concerns that pension tax changes are discouraging them from doing extra work for patients. That's why the government will consult on how to introduce new flexibilities for this critically important staff group. But we're not complacent. We know there is more work to do to secure the people, the leadership and the culture the NHS needs. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has asked Baroness Harding, the Chairman of NHS Improvement, to lead further work over the summer to prepare the final People Plan. As has always been intended, a final People Plan will be published soon after the conclusion of the spending review, when there will be further clarity on education and training budgets. I'd like to take this opportunity once again, Mr. Speaker, to place on record my thanks, and the thanks, I'm sure, of everybody across the whole House, to all the extraordinary NHS staff who do a wonderful job ensuring that our constituents, their patients, get excellent care.
Jonathan Ashworth.
Well, it's a pleasure, as always, to see the Minister of State, but the Secretary of State should be doing his day job and be here answering questions about the health service, not playing his Tory leadership games. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, our NHS is struggling with vacancies of 100,000. Our NHS staff are the very best in the world, and none of them want to be part of a trade deal with the Americans, of course, but they are working under immense pressure because of these chronic shortages. Shortages put patient care at risk, and it means standards of care are falling. It means our constituents wait longer to get a GP appointment because we've lost 1,000 GPs. It means women are turned away from maternity units because we're short of 3,500 midwives. It means cancer diagnosis is delayed because of shortages in the cancer workforce. And as Dido Harding's report shows, we have 40,000 shortages for nurses. We are short of 40,000 nurses in the workforce, which is now critical. It means, for example, at a time when mental health problems are increasing, and the Lancet reports today on an increase in non-suicidal self-harm, yet we've actually lost 5,000 mental health nurses since 2010. We have problems in the learning disability sector, and Higher Education England today warns that because of the shortages in learning disability nursing, that we are set to hit critical levels in the next 5 years, with vacancies of 30%. We have an ageing population. Adult social care itself is short of 110,000 staff, and yet district nursing has been cut by 50%. We don't have enough nurses on our children's wards. Health visitors and school nurses in our communities have been cut. And this NHS workforce crisis is linked to decisions of this government. As Dido Harding's report says, applications for nursing and midwifery courses have fallen since the education funding reforms. Those education funding reforms is the abolition of the bursary. So isn't that a damning indictment of that decision by this government to abolish the bursary? And will he now commit to bringing the bursary back? The report also references continuing professional development, budgets which have been cut by 1/3. The report says employers have been investing less in their people as pressures on NHS finances have grown. Isn't that an admission that Tory austerity and 9 years of underfunding in the NHS has contributed to the workforce crisis of today? The Health Secretary said he wants a new Windrush generation of overseas nurses to fill the staffing gap. So can the Minister explain why a commitment to recruit 5,000 extra nurses a year internationally was dropped from the Dido Harding report? Did government put pressure on Baroness Harding? And on international recruitment, can he guarantee that anyone offered a job in the NHS or care sector will not be restricted by the £30,000 salary cap, as the Chair of Health Education England called for yesterday at the Select Committee? Finally, he references the spending review. He will have seen the Chief Secretary's comments yesterday at a Select Committee, saying that a spending review is now unlikely to be ready for 2020-21. That means new funding for training, new funding for Health Education England and new funding for capital investment for public health and indeed social care won't come on stream until 2021, 2 years away. Does he really think that is an acceptable way to deal with the NHS crisis that we are now facing? I really do urge the Minister, who I have a lot of respect for, that we cannot keep delaying this situation longer and longer. The Health Secretary needs to abandon his leadership games and focus on his day job and get a grip.
Mr. Speaker, the House will have listened to the honourable gentleman. It is perhaps important to put out some facts which were missing in his fact-free analysis. 52,000 more professionally qualified clinical staff in the last 9 years. Almost more doctors and over 17,000 more nurses on our wards. He laid out a list of promises that he would want to see, but with little detail and actually no means to pay for them. There were a number of things he said that I would questions I'm just going to respond to. He talked about the number of nurses and said that there was no plan. There clearly is. Increasing nursing is a priority. And this plan sets out, if the Honourable Lady would like to listen, this plan sets out a focus to ensure that we can recruit those nurses. He talks about applications, but he will know that applications for nursing places is up 4% on the previous year. He will also know that the plan sets out 5,000 more clinical placements available in September this year, which is a 25% increase on the previous year. He will also know that the plan sets out for 7,500 more nursing associates. The plan also sets out, quite clearly, measures that will ensure that we will make sure that the NHS is the best place to work, and therefore more nurses will want to stay in it. He made a number of other issues which he spoke about. The Migration Advisory Committee has set out recommendations which he will have seen. He will know that the Secretary of State has set out a firm commitment to ensure that we intend to continue to recruit internationally as well as increasing domestic recruitment. He will know that we have seen what he said about CPD and continuous professional development. It would be useful, though, if he had also read the plan, which sets out commitments to ensuring the continuing education and opportunities for education for all staff within the NHS. And he will have seen also